This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Emma Fay and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Guildhouse. I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders, their ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. I would like to welcome you all here this evening on behalf of ACE Open, the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and Guildhouse for our presentation as part of Perspectives. Perspectives is a series of thought-provoking lectures inviting leading artists, makers and cultural thinkers to Adelaide to engage with compelling ideas currently shaping our world. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and present our first in-person event for 2020 in the Perspective series. After the year that's been, it feels like such a privilege to be with you and to be welcoming an interstate guest speaker to speak with us tonight. Tonight we'll hear from esteemed writer, editor and arts fashion academic Alison Kubler as she explores the intersections between contemporary visual art and fashion. The session tonight is being recorded and a video will be available to watch on the Hawke Centre website next week, and Guildhouse and ACE will also share the link with our audiences as well. We encourage you to bring this to the attention of friends and colleagues who couldn't be here with us tonight. As we are recording, please do switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions, but feel free to join in the Twitter conversation using the links shown behind me. It's my pleasure now to introduce Alison. Alison Kubler has a double major in art history from the University of Queensland and a master's in post-war and contemporary art history from Manchester University, England. Alison has over 20 years' experience working as a curator in museums and galleries across Australia. She worked as an arts advisor to the Federal Minister for the Arts and Sport and held full-time curatorial positions at QUT Art Museum and Gold Coast City Art Gallery. Alison is a member of the Council of the National Gallery of Australia and ambassador for the Institute of Modern Art in Queensland. She is a regular contributor to art journals and magazines on the subjects of art and fashion and is currently the editor of Vault magazine. Please join me in welcoming Alison Kubler.
Thank you. I should also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to very much thank the Guildhouse, ACE Open Studios and the Prime Minister, the Bob Hawke Centre for having me here. I actually can't believe I'm standing here. This is so incredible to me. I've come from Queensland, and so I'm clean, just so you know. I have the piece of paper to say so. But I was, just an aside, it was a very nerve-wracking flight this morning, only because it was the first flight in many, many, many months, and I just wasn't sure what to expect. And of course, it was completely normal and like every other flight, except when I got off the plane and there were 25 policemen there. And then everything you've ever done in your past starts to, you think, oh my God, that's right. No, it's just Corona, it's fine. So here I am, and I'm so thrilled to be here to speak to you all. Thank you for coming out and for being brave and coming out to gather together, because I think we're going to have to do that, don't we, to move on and to hear from people and to engage in the world again. This is a subject very close to my heart. I've had I've given many talks about art and fashion over the years, and as you may or may not know, I co-authored this book, Art and Fashion in the 21st Century. And I guess in the preparation of this lecture, I was thinking about how much had actually changed, or rather how many new things had been added to the agenda since I wrote that book. And I'm always noting and always writing and thinking about stories that I'd like to write. on the subject of art and fashion. And I think it started for me when I was studying my art history at the University of Queensland. I did some studies into art fashion history then, and I loved it so much. I remember very keenly thinking, this is amazing. This is a fascinating part of art history that you don't really get taught much about at all. It's almost like a bit of a folly to study that if you're studying art history. And yet, of course, one of the most interesting things about paintings from the past is the costuming and the clothing that appears in it. And as I always say to people, when you study art history, you're really studying social history. You're studying the history of the world. And so for me, it's sort of interesting, this intersection between art and fashion, which is a very specific thing in terms of how fashion appears within art in a very literal sense, but then also how art and fashion have come together in a more collaborative way since the 20th century and now into the new millennium, and how we look forward to the future and how they might connect. So I guess the topic tonight was, does art need fashion as much as fashion needs art? And I don't actually know that I've got the answer for that for you, but I think it's something that we can tease out a little bit tonight. And I should add that I have some images here that will appear, and they really are, I guess, a kind of eye candy, so you're a little bit distracted from me. Not all of them will be particularly relevant to the thing I'm talking about at the time, but hopefully they will trigger something for you. So I guess to begin with, I think one of the things that is very interesting in the new millennium, which almost seems like old now because we're way past that, we're in a pandemic. Oh my God! And the global fashion industry, certainly with the turn of the new millennium, really started to look to art in a very direct way. And I think that was an interesting time for fashion brands because we were coming out of a second sort of global financial crisis, which again seems like a distant memory. Wouldn't we just give anything for a global financial crisis instead of a pandemic? It was a time of great uncertainty, and people were really trying to think of ways to, I guess, stop everything collapsing. And the other interesting thing about that is that fashion has become an industry and also like a financial system in its own right, much more than it even was in the 20th century. The fashion system now is something completely other. It's an economic powerhouse. And that's one of the things I'd like to tease out a bit tonight, because I think that's one of the reasons that we are sort of in the dilemma that we're in. And I know a lot of us now are thinking about sustainable fashion and eco-fashion, which is a whole other topic, but it's an interesting point that we find ourselves in. So some of the world's largest luxury brands have really looked to, fashion, to art, to really reinvent themselves, as it were. And some of them have had a slightly more philanthropic approach, so they've established a foundation or something independent to their fashion business, while others have very specifically invited artists to collaborate with them. And so that really what that started was it ignited a debate about whether fashion is art, which is like this enduring debate. And I think what's interesting about that is that you sort of can't discuss fashion and art without really unpacking what that might mean. And the image on screen, I think, is a very interesting one, because in my studies, I haven't so much looked to the past, but I think you have to in terms of going forward. So I put this here because it's such a fantastic image of Elsa Schiaparelli's lobster dress. And the reason that this dress is so significant is because she collaborated with Salvador Dali on it. Now, of course, for those of you, I'm sure everyone knows, Salvador Dali was a famous surrealist, and the lobster for him was a very potent sexual symbol. And of course, Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a great revolutionary and loved to be a provocateur and had worked with other artists, loved this idea of putting this sexual thing onto a very delicate evening gown. But of course, the thing that's so interesting about this gown is that the most famous person who ever wore it was Wallis Simpson. And then she was photographed by Cecil Beaton wearing this dress. So the photograph of Wallis Simpson, the most disgraced woman in the history of English, well, maybe after Meghan Markle, I don't know now. Like, is that the thing that everyone says about her? Wallis Simpson, that was sort of arguably one of the first great paparazzi photographs ever taken, although it wasn't paparazzi, but it was a celebrity photograph, Cecil Beaton. And you have Wallis Simpson, it's a little bit see-through, the sun is shining through it. she's wearing the lobster dress. It was such a provocation at the time, and it kind of made this dress the icon that it is, which I wanted to put it up there as an idea. Because I think that the thing we need to think about is that if we're going to have a dialogue about art and fashion and their relationship, we need to understand that by any definition, not all art is in fact art, with a capital A, which is a notion that's similarly applicable to fashion. So if we talk about art, we know that there's so much art in the world, but not all of it is art that would appear in a museum or a gallery. Similarly, not all fashion is what you would consider high fashion. So we have a distinction already between clothing that we wear and high fashion that we might consider collectible. And so within each discipline of art and the discipline of fashion, there is kind of a hierarchy of high and low, and how we understand those things to sit within that hierarchy. So then a discussion about art and fashion is really a discussion about those kind of definitions, in the recognition that those hierarchies have all but collapsed, of course. We know that they don't really exist anymore other than as philosophical kind of ideas. And I think what's interesting about that is that we really can go back to someone like Andy Warhol, who was early as the late 1950s. I mean, many people would say that he is the greatest artist of all time, and I would potentially agree with that. He was the first person to really say, what we make is a commercial endeavour. What artists are doing is a commercial gesture. And then, of course, even before him, Marcel Duchamp was saying that he was challenging the idea of high art by suggesting that everything, like using ready-mades, it's an incredibly simple gesture. But if you think about the gesture of Duchamp and then the gesture of Warhol taking a Campbell's soup can and turning it into high art, it actually just upended everything and collapsed the whole hierarchy as we understood it of high and low. So it's sort of interesting that we even have this debate now about what is high and what is low. So I think that one of the things, if we come down to this idea of why they might be philosophically opposed, and I think this is quite an intriguing concept. And I think it comes down to this. Fashion, we understand it to be fickle. It's transient, it's constantly in flux, it's always changing. Fashion, we understand to have a commercial imperative behind it. It's something that is a good that is exchanged and bought, it's sold. Art, we understand, and art historically posits itself in a kind of much more noble sense. So art and artists have always been sort of on a higher level, because the very simple concept that you don't need art, you need clothing. You don't need art. So artists, what they are making is something that is pure and ostensibly untainted by any kind of commercial imperative. So it's always been able to have this kind of idea of an intellectual quality behind it. And that's all those things that we talk about when we talk about art being elitist, and it's for people who have a knowledge and a wealth and an understanding. And so when we think about these very simple, big ideas, philosophical ideas, fashion is fast, it's fickle, it changes. One of the simple things about art is if you talk to any artist, and there's some here tonight, they will argue, will usually make a campaign for the idea that they want their work and their ideas to have longevity, to live beyond them. That's one of the greatest, central constructs behind the making of art, whether it's music, literature, visual arts, dance, is that it should have longevity. Fashion has never really stood for that. It's about a constant, what would be the new thing, how would you change it, how would you do that? Now, all of those things I say in the full knowledge that none of those definitions are accurate at all, because of course we know that art has a commercial imperative. It's 2020. Who are we kidding? Artists need to sell, and they make work to sell. There is a huge commercial system built around visual contemporary art, around old art. It's a massive system in its own right. So if we talk about fashion as being a huge economic system, we can look to the art world in exactly the same right. So fashion has Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, these huge corporate entities that own many multi-brands underneath them. The art world is exactly the same. If you look at the private and the auction house system, it's exactly the same structure. And then if you look at commercial galleries and how commercial galleries work, they take a percentage of profits. None of it is just like a handshake and I'm so glad you made that artwork. That's not how it works. I think what's interesting about that is how we love to cling to these ideas, though. We love to hold on to the concept that somehow visual arts are more, or rather the arts is more pure. It's a more untainted idea. And what's interesting about that is certainly when I was studying art history, it was you would never have seen fashion in a contemporary art gallery. You just didn't. I'm not that old, but you just didn't. You didn't see fashion in contemporary museums and galleries. Now it's everywhere. You see it in almost every institution. The Art Gallery of South Australia had an amazing show, Fashion Icons, that I was very lucky to work on with Robert. Very fortunate to have that exhibition here. It's big shows like that that are slowly changing the way we understand how fashion is valued and seen as a system. And I think that one of the ideas, one of the central things, we can even come back to these very original ideas. If we go back to think about Walter Benjamin and his ideas about art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So his very simple concept was that if you repeat a thing in multiple and you just produce it and produce it and produce it, somewhere along the line, the authenticity and the aura is lost from that object. And this is one of those great, debates. And isn't it interesting that we are seeing now a huge return to the handmade? It's fascinating to me, and particularly with the corona pandemic. Hands up if you've made bread. Anyone made bread? Come on, I made bread. Everyone made bread. People taught themselves how to make sourdough, for God's sake. It's 2020. You can buy it. No, I'm just kidding. But it's an interesting thing because that's a very artisanal gesture to learn how to do it and to make something, right? So there is a return, not just a return, it's never gone away, but there's a very specific interest in learning a craft and something that you use your hands on, right? That's about that authentic engagement and that experience of creating and making something. It's very palpable. And as anyone who's ever gone to an art gallery, the thing that you're going for is arguably to have that kind of haptic experience. You're looking to find something. You want some kind of connection, some feeling that you are connecting with. Is that the aura of the artwork? I don't know. I suspect it might be. I think it's one of the reasons we love to go and hear artists talk in their studios or see them talk about their work, because we kind of want to connect on some level to what that might be. So this idea, if we think about, the aura and authenticity, it is very interesting that when we had this global financial crisis, luxury brands did better than high street fashion brands. Okay, so the entire world is crumbling. All the big banks are dying. They're all crumbling. People losing their entire life savings. All of the luxury brands turned the biggest profits they've ever turned, ever. It's a very interesting thing, because if you look at what a company like Hermès will do, or Yves Saint Laurent, for example, which is now just Saint Laurent, they are selling you the idea of authenticity. They're selling you the idea of the handmade. So Hermès' entire existence is based on the fact that their handbags are handmade. They are hand-stitched by a series of individuals, sometimes one individual who will make one handbag from beginning to end. People pay more for something that they think bears the hand of a maker, an artisan. I think you can't discount that. I think that's a very interesting thing. And so, for example, similarly during the war, like World War II, what were the things that sold really well? Stockings, lipsticks, items of luxury that people thought, well, I don't have that much money, but the money that I have, I'll put it towards something that is of good value, and I will hold on to that. It's exactly what happened after the global financial crisis, is that those brands, and you look at Gucci, for example, it's just turning billion-dollar profits, even now in the middle of a pandemic. I think that's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. It goes a lot to the ideas of what it is to be a consumer, but it also goes to the idea of what it is we are kind of craving on some level, some connection to an object, to a thing, which I'm coming to. I just want to show you these lovely images of Yves Saint Laurent and the Mondrian. So this is something that was happening a lot in the 20th century. It's now been really monetized in quite a different way. So if we think again about this very simple idea about what art is as compared to what fashion is, I think the closest you ever come in fashion to art is haute couture. So, and again, if you were lucky enough, I don't know how many of you saw Fashion Icons, that exhibition. There were some incredible pieces of couture in that show, just phenomenal. And, you know, this idea of haute couture is that it exists in direct opposition to fast mainstream fashion. It has no practical purpose at all. You don't wear it down to the shops. This is not clothing made for the function of clothing you. And it's, you know, it's most often associated with flights of fantasy and excess and theatre. The beautiful theatrical presentations that go along with haute couture are one of the reasons that people engage with it. And as such, of course, it's accompanied by exorbitant prices. Now, again, at the time, people were saying, well, this will be the death of haute couture. This will be the end of it, because how many women can actually afford a $20,000 dress, right? And that's the beginning price before you get even, that's like base price for haute couture. And yet, in fact, haute couture has done really, really well. It will never die, right? Because there will always be a market for it. And again, anyone saw the Valentino show in Brisbane? Did anyone see that exhibition? Or any of the beautiful films that you've seen recently? There's so many great fashion films. It is this idea of the handmade, the cutting and the sewing and the people who've put all the effort into the making and the doing. And I would say that, you know, that when we talk about this, a lot of people say fashion is not art. I would actually say yes, couture is. It's incredible. The amount of work that goes into making a couture gown is something quite other. And this is what, again, come back to this idea between capital F fashion and small f fashion. Haute couture is capital F fashion. It's the stuff that museums and galleries collect. And importantly, the thing about haute couture is that it is imbued with the sense of touch. It absolutely has the hand of the maker in it. And I think one of those famous stories about Alexander McQueen is that he had written he sewed, I'm trying to think, it was like something very rude, inside the Prince of Wales jackets when he was a tailor at the time. I think those things are incredibly fantastic and meaningful. Quite aside from, again, these are just eye candy things, but I want you to see like this connection that is happening here. I think what's interesting about that too is that it's even interesting that there's always a debate. People go, oh, that's a terrible amount of money to spend on fashion. How could people spend $20,000 on a dress? And yet we know people go and spend much, 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 much more on art. And somehow that is okay. That is an okay thing to do. And it has respect. And it's actually has a legitimate value to it. And yet they're exactly the same thing. They're the same thing. It's a folly, as it were. You know, like they're very high risk things to buy and collect, because neither of them really have an intrinsic value. It's a value that's applied from the outside, right? Someone else saying that has value and I'm prepared to pay this for it. This is an interesting dilemma with ready-to-wear fashion, because it has no value. And even probably since we wrote this book, and the thing that I'm observing now is that you probably have observed this too as consumers, is this incredible swing against ready-to-wear fashion, which I think a lot of us have been feeling, but now it's really palpable, it's really happening, because we know that ready-to-wear fashion is literally going and being dug into the ground in landfill. There's too much of it, right? So clothing will go straight from a store with the tags on it, and it goes into a furnace or into the ground. It never sees the light of day. Like literally, it's gone. That is completely untenable, obviously. And I think that we're at this really interesting tipping point, because what happened again with the GFC is that all of these top-end brands, the highest brands in the world, they all thrived. All the low brands did really well. All the mid-level brands fell over completely. because if you were selling something for around $120, you couldn't really sustain it. It just wasn't going to work. If you were selling it for $5, people would buy it. If you were selling it for $500, people would buy it. All the mid-level brands just fell over, which is super interesting. Similarly, in the global financial crisis, the world's biggest artists still sold work, still made work that sold for millions and millions of dollars. That did not change because the top 1% does not change. They are unaffected by that. So that model doesn't change for them. Those values are still there. I think what's interesting about this explosion then, and I guess this collapsing of these value systems where we understand art to be high and fashion to be low, and the fact that they have collapsed leaves us at an interesting point. It's like, how then do you move forward as a fashion brand to do something that is meaningful or has purpose at all? You know, like, can actually fashion have a purpose at all? And this is a slight diversion, but how beautiful is this Dior by Raph Simmons? An incredible, incredible collection that was. And again, an example of haute couture, and obviously this talking to a history of art, but it's more an interpretation. Again, Rodarte, looking at Van Gogh, the fantastic Alexander McQueen, just so beautiful, such incredible work. And you know, one of the things I think is interesting is to think about some of the figures in history who have made work that endures. So, like specifically, there are fashion designers that we want to collect, we want to enjoy, want to have their work because they did something different. And one of them, I'm coming to, Victor and Rolf is one of the brands I wanted to talk about, because Victor and Rolf is such an interesting brand. Incredible designers from Holland. The way that they think about fashion is the opposite of fashion. Everything they do is kind of like a gesture about a very knowing look and a wink and a collapsing and saying these things don't have a value. This is ludicrous. We are making couture fashion. It's completely and utterly stupid. Like, no one is going to wear it. Literally making this gown. They'd made these incredible gowns, cutting holes through them. It's the most beautiful work I've ever seen in my whole life. It's incredible. I think they deserve to be understood as artists because their project is more a concept than a fashion show or a fashion collection. It's something that exists outside the system of fashion. What's interesting about it is that almost all of these brands make their money by selling perfume. That's what they do. That's how they do it, all of them. Dior, you name it. That's how they make their bread and butter on a daily basis because people are not buying $100,000 gowns, nor are they really buying ready-to-wear. They are buying perfume. And Victor and Rolf know that. They know that. This is like a small collection that you're making with a concept and an idea behind it. And this is so amazing. So their collections have always been very vast, you know, very elaborate. And what they've done is they've now, for their two recent collections, they have worked with their own dead stock, right? So dead stock is when you have fabric that you've never used, basically. And normally that also goes into a warehouse or gets dug into the ground or burnt, something like that. But they have used work from their own collections that never got used and turned it into collections. And I tried to get some of those images, but I invite you to go and have a look. I think that's an incredible gesture from some of the greatest designers working today. This very punky gesture to take something that no one really wants to buy, no one really wants to wear it, but it's them saying, well, if you want more Victor and Rolf, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get us doing this. So I think that what's interesting about this is this idea that we have this idea too that fashion is only relevant so long as it is moving forward. And yet, of course, that requires for it to look backward at the same time. And that's something that artists have always known about. Artists have always looked to the past to go forward. That is a very artistic gesture, to think about the past and how it might inform the future. And almost every artist I've ever known has looked historically to something, to read something new about the world. There's this idea that beyond, appropriation and self-reflexivity, art's purpose has been absorbed into a capitalist model, so that art now enjoys the status of a luxury item, and it appears alongside handbags, shoes, yachts, and watches, as an object of desire. I don't know if anyone's ever been to an art fair before. Has anyone here been to an art fair? A Sydney Contemporary or something? I think what's amazing about that is that I've been fortunate enough to go to the Venice Biennale on a few occasions, and there's always this day before the Venice Biennale opens, and suddenly all these yachts appear out of nowhere, and they all come into the Grand Canal. And it's like a Bond movie, and they just disgorge these Russian oligarchs and their wives. And they go through the Biennale and they just buy things like bang, bang, bang. And they drop millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And all of them look impossibly chic because they are so chic and they have so much money. And it's this interesting thing because you're actually at this huge international art event, and there's art from all over the world, and there's curators and artists, and it's extraordinary. And then suddenly you have all this money in the world there at the same time, and you realize this is what it is. This is the system. This is how it works. They are the same thing. The people buying the fashion are the ones buying the work too. They buy it in the same way. So if you think about it, it makes sense for a fashion brand to say, well, let's work with an artist and get something that we don't have. What does fashion want? It wants longevity. It wants authenticity. When you work with an artist, you get both. You get something that you did not have before. So because art is collectible and it's covetable, so it's entirely logical that the two of them should actually come together because, as I said, collectors of expensive contemporary art wear and buy expensive contemporary fashion. So there's a mutual audience for both genres. What's interesting about that is that some houses do it really, really well. And the one that is, this is Damien Hirst for Alexander McQueen. I'll come back to McQueen in a minute. I wanted to talk about, they make me laugh. I wanted to talk about Louis Vuitton because when Marc Jacobs was at Louis Vuitton, he was really responsible for changing the fortunes of that company. So Marc Jacobs went to Louis Vuitton, and it was a very respectable, beautiful, old French luggage house. But it was old. They didn't have a contemporary audience. They didn't have contemporary young people buying what they made. Marc Jacobs himself was a young designer and a bit, punk. And he decided, well, actually, I want to do that. I want to make this house young again. So he did something really rebellious. He engaged Stephen Sprouse, the late Stephen Sprouse. He took his spray paint designs and put them onto handbags. Then he worked with Takashi Murakami. Then he worked with Richard Prince, which I love, such a funny gesture. He worked with almost every designer that you can think of. He's worked with Cindy Sherman, with every artist that you can think of. And it was such an inspired gesture because even in taking this famous old pattern, this is the logo handbag here, the most iconic thing about Louis Vuitton, the thing that you would never change, and he changed it. Right? So he did something really kind of sacrilegious. He took this logo that was immediately recognizable and made it something that people had never actually seen before. And I love the punk of that gesture. So of course, when Louis Vuitton did that, it changed the goalpost for every single brand. Every brand decided, oh my God, we need to do that. Because what was interesting about that, in putting an artist's artwork onto a handbag, right? Now, it's a handbag. They turned that handbag into something collectible and covetable, something that people wanted to have, and in small numbers. Now, they weren't like an artwork small number multiple. They were still thousands of handbags, but still a small enough number that people absolutely needed and wanted to have them. I think this is really a fascinating thing to do because if you look at, so this is Takashi Murakami, and that's the flower is Stephen Sprouse, Takashi Murakami cherries. It was such an interesting thing too with Takashi Murakami, who had been, was a very respected Japanese artist, had always worked with, he was considered like a postmodern artist. He had this part of this art movement called super flat, which was at the time a meshing of a high and low, which was a kind of conflation of a Japanese graphic design with the hyper-consumerism that existed in Japan. So Takashi Murakami's always been involved in all of that. And Marc Jacobs was so astute. What did he recognize? Who buys Louis Vuitton? Japanese people. Japanese people go to France, buy Louis Vuitton. They love it. So why not put those two things together? Well, of course, it was like a huge, huge, huge success. And no one thought it would. So if you go and you look at this collection, it's incredible. It's so irreverent and so silly and so stupid, but people absolutely loved it, and they bought it in droves. These things are highly, highly collectible now. You actually can't really get them. And if you go online, you can see how much money they go for now. It's a vast amount of money. But it was such a radical gesture for him to take this very iconic brand, but it turned into their greatest commercial success ever. So then it was like about how do you repeat that commercial success? How do you keep doing it so that you can make something still, you've got to create again, because fashion is about new. It's about, you've got to keep reinventing it. You need to offer the new thing and the new thing and the new thing. And I want to come back to Richard Prince, because I think this is one of the funniest collaborations I've ever seen that I loved. So Richard Prince, famously makes these handbags, or rather, makes these joke paintings that are usually quite rude. And they're a joke about, they're taken from the 1950s, like they're funny jokes, or not very funny jokes. They're like dad jokes, actually, and they'll often be quite disparaging about women. And so I can't think of one now, but he put them onto handbags. And I always love this idea of a woman walking around with a joke that's quite rude about women on a handbag. It's like this incredibly funny double joke that Richard Prince was having, and they were, again, a massive seller. So he had done these nurse paintings as well, Richard Prince. And so Louis Vuitton kind of took it on board, the whole thing, the jokes and the nurses and everything. This is very Marc Jacobs, again, a very punky, quite a rude gesture, if you like. And people lapped it up, because it is about a kind of, I guess what it also did was it brought fun back to fashion. But it started to make... ironically, make the art world look to fashion in a way that it had never looked. That was the biggest thing that Louis Vuitton did, is that they made the art world start to value fashion in a way that it had not done before, to be less disparaging. Suddenly, the art world could see that there was money to be made from collaborating with fashion. So suddenly you have this bit of a flip of the narrative, where previously the fashion world had looked to art for a kind of approbation and a respect and a value and all of these things that it was missing because it's deemed to be commercial and fickle and changing. Suddenly the art world wanted in on that, and how then do you do that in a meaningful way? This, again, is such an interesting collaboration, because Yayoi Kusama is, again, a very highly regarded artist in the art world and well known to anyone who works in the art world. But when you have Louis Vuitton take her on as an artist, it changed it again for her. You become incredibly famous across the world in a way that I think she was probably not even aware that she was going to become like a household name in quite that way. I think there's such interesting radical gestures. So it's one thing to take a handbag and put an artist's artwork on it, but it sometimes is a bit hollow. It's a bit of a hollow gesture. And I just wanted to flick forward. I find this is a very interesting one. I just came across this recently. This is actually Coach, which is, one of those great iconic American brands that is constantly trying to reinvent itself and find a value and a purpose for itself, because it's a little bit redundant in a way. And of course, they've done a collaboration with Basquiat, the late Basquiat. I use that. I think this is important. It's an important fact, because it's his estate that is managing that collaboration. Now, of course, it has raised a lot of eyebrows. Maybe we can have a conversation about that later. But I find this quite interesting, because it's a moment in time, isn't it? And this collection sort of emerged at the same time as Black Lives Matter. It was very interesting, and the response was very mixed. Some people thought it was fantastic, some people thought it was really abhorrent, and strange. It's one of those things, and it sort of went under the radar. It's a very strange collaboration. But I would argue that's probably one of those collaborations that doesn't translate very well. So it's not a perfect model. You can't just take an artwork and put it on an object and think that it's going to sell and it's going to have value and become iconic, because it won't. It just won't. And I come back now to Dior. So there's a new designer at Dior now, Maria Grazia Curie, who's, I think, really interesting. And one of the projects that they've been working on for some time now is a project called Lady Dior, where they have worked with a huge number of female artists to come up with, this is their iconic bag. Famously, Princess Diana had this bag, the Lady Dior. And every year they invite a suite of artists to reimagine that handbag, and it's produced in a very small number, so it's highly, highly collectible. And I think it actually is an interesting exercise in trying to make something meaningful out of a handbag, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but it is an interesting thing. And you know what's really interesting about this? Some of these are really ugly. Just going to say it. Like, they are really, really ugly. And that's okay to say, I think. It's one of those interesting things about fashion, is that it's obviously in the eye of the beholder. But I'm interested in that gesture because, to me, what's, I guess, interesting about that is a willingness to be creative and experimental. And that's not generally something that the fashion world, small f fashion, runs with so much, because it's not always profitable to do so. You can really only experiment at that level when you are, Dior. And that brings me to this interesting collection that they showed earlier, before the pandemic. So in recent years, she's been doing a lot of work with artists, and that's something that she's very passionate about. And I'm really interested in this collection because she worked with Judy Chicago, the great feminist artist, and she invited her to create these banners. So when you walked in, so it's like walking into a vagina, actually. That's what the exhibition, that's what the show was like. So you walked into this womb-like shape, and inside were these banners that she had made, which I think were really extraordinary. It was a very interesting thing, and the fashion world was really confused, very confused. Like, what are we doing? I don't really know what's going on here. But I thought that was such a bold gesture to do. And you might have seen the T-shirts that she did as well. We should all be feminists, which was taking the great famous statement from the 1970s. And of course, people freaked out about that because the T-shirts were $700. And what had originally been, something that like a bookstore had come up with in the 1970s in New York. So there's always this mistrust in the art world of fashion because there's a financial dollar attached to it. And yet, as we know, there's a financial dollar attached to the art world as well. And that's such an interesting thing. It's just we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about art having money attached to it or making money out of art. But we do. That's how it works. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist at all. Like, if you're not selling artwork and artists, how would artists survive? There's nothing dirty about that. It's just how it works, We sell, an artist makes work and they sell it. It's just that you're not really around to talk about that, which is quite interesting. I think I'm conscious of time here as well. Gosh, that went really quick. One of the things that I think is interesting too about, art and fashion and how they come together. So you have these interesting collaborations, but that's sort of not enough, really, is it? Like, it's just an object or an item or something. So how else do fashion and art come together? And I've often thought that it is in the form of the way we look at fashion shows. Now, this is an interesting thing too, because now we're in this sort of sustainable era. We are talking, and fashion designers and fashion brands are talking about reducing the cycle. So in the 20th century, fashion used to be spring, summer, and then autumn, winter. So 2 seasons. And then, of course, it's just sort of like exploded out of all kind of perspective. And suddenly you have 6 seasons in a year because you also have cruise, and then you have fall, and then you have the collection for skiing, like ridiculous things, all ways to make money for a brand. And, brands would go to enormous lengths to take clients. I think, recently Dior took everyone to Morocco. So they take their high-end clients to Morocco for a show, to see that show. And interestingly, at that show, she had worked with a very significant African-American artist called Mickalene Thomas. And she invited Mickalene Thomas to come up with designs that were then put onto gowns. And they were really beautiful. But it's an interesting thing because Mickalene Thomas got a bit of backlash about that, and Dior did too. So it's never, ever settled. It's never a thing where it's just, easy. There's always this thing about there's money attached, which I just don't understand because it's someone's got to make money at the end of the day. This idea, when you think about the spectacle, and I always think about John Galliano and when he was at Dior and his incredibly elaborate fashion presentations, so beautiful, and it's like theatre. And I love the kind of folly of it, this 30-minute presentation, but it's as big as an opera or as major as a feature film. And of course, that's kind of not cool now. You're not allowed to do that anymore because we live in a different age, and so there's this idea that, well, understandably, is it ethical to fly people all the way to Morocco from all over the world? It's not a great sort of footprint on the environment to do that. So all of those things are changing quite a lot. And in this recent pandemic era, it's worth going online to have a look at some of the things that designers did because they couldn't actually do shows. So they did do collaborations with artists where they were thinking about how do we present a show that no one can actually see in the flesh, right? So they were doing them in Zoom, but then they also did interesting things where they worked with an artist to come up with like a box, and the box then had paper dolls inside, and you could cut out the paper dolls and then cut out the clothing and put them on the dolls yourself, like a very old school idea of how to look at fashion. But I'm interested in this way that, the idea that everything has become so escalated, and I think this in the art world too, as someone who works in publishing, the relentlessness of the art cycle, it's so exhausting. We're all on Instagram and social media all the time. I'm just personally bombarded by so many images, and fashion is the same thing. So it's about how do you shout louder? How do you make something that is interesting to look at, enduring? How does it actually exist outside of that 24-hour cycle? How do you make something that people want to actually buy and hold on to? It's a real trick, I think, to be able to do that. And again, not everyone is able to do it. Oh, this is Mickalene Thomas for Dior. So I think interesting to look at. Very, very elaborate presentation. And just to come back to that for a minute, this is an interesting collection too because she, as head designer of Dior, decided that she really needed to work with traditional artisans. So it was very much an attempt to work with the real women who make the real objects. So for the first time, now designers are actually listing all of the people who've ever worked on an object in their catalogues. That never happened in the past. They were just people in the background making things, and I think that's really kind of interesting. So, sorry, I'm looking at the time. I don't want to bore you. So many things have changed in such a short time, and I think for all of us now, and again, even when we wrote this book, at that time, there was a real change in the way people were buying objects and buying things in general. It was really at the time that online shopping was exploding. Now, what's interesting about the pandemic is that online shopping has gone ballistic. It's like that, no one can actually keep up with it now. So at the time that we were writing that book, a lot of stores, a lot of bricks and mortar stores, and I was talking earlier about those mid-tier brands that just fell over because they couldn't keep up with how fast-paced everything was going. You had designer brands building what can really only be described as almost like architectural icons or churches almost. So if you think about the buildings that Prada has designed or Balenciaga or Givenchy, you go into and they work with, Dior works with Peter Marino, they work with incredible architects, very famous architects. They're the kind of architects that public art institutions could never afford to work with in a million years because they are so expensive. They're like the Frank Gehry's of the world. They are starchitects, in short. But these brands are very, very powerful, and they're massive. So Prada can afford to work with Rem Koolhaas and buy a palazzo in Venice and renovate it. That's extraordinary. That's a kind of money that these fashion brands have. They have huge amounts of money. And so Prada, I think, is one of those that stands outside the pack because they have incredible stores which are like museums. And it's a very clever strategy. If you go into a Louis Vuitton now, I think you'll become quickly aware that you'll see artworks in store, and you'll also see books, and you'll see things that have cultural value to them. That is a strategy that Louis Vuitton has very deliberately employed. They want you to walk in there and see their store almost as it were a museum. It has that same quality to it. And of course, importantly, Louis Vuitton does have its own massive art foundation. They have an incredible museum in Paris. They sponsor things worldwide. All of these brands that I'm talking about are key sponsors of the arts. That's not an accident, that's a very deliberate strategy because they understand the alignment between the two. Now, honestly, 20 years ago, that kind of wasn't a cool thing to do. Like it wasn't the thing that you did. But now it's very normal for Gucci to sponsor the arts completely. Interesting, Louis Vuitton did sponsor Yayoi Kusama's massive exhibition. This is how it works. It's a very interconnected thing. The thing about walking into those shops is that sometimes you'll go in and there might only be 4 items of clothing on the rack. It's very intimidating. I don't know if you've ever done that. It's worth doing. Don't be intimidated. Go in store and have a look. Even Tiffany & Co., have beautiful objects which are from their archive, so you can actually go and see them. Whilst you're looking at your smaller items, you can see the things that they created back in the 1920s and 30s. I think that's a really clever strategy. That's about creating a sense of that earlier thing I was talking about, authenticity and heritage and all the things that you were going into Tiffany & Co. to buy. You're going in there to buy that object for $120 because you want the thing that Tiffany & Co. did back in 1920. You're trying to buy something that is meaningful and enduring and lasting. That's just how it works. It's a very simple strategy. This idea, though, that now people are moving online, so does that make bricks and mortar stores redundant? Well, no, it doesn't, which is really interesting. So you'll see more and more stores popping up. Like, I think in the middle of the pandemic, a new a new Burberry went into Brisbane. There's a new Fendi, stores that I'm like, really? Is that really? It just seems so bizarre to me that these stores are going in. But in fact, yes, they're beautiful. And the architects have come out and they're in quarantine, which is funny. And then they're doing these incredible fit-outs of these stores that probably no one will actually go in store to buy an object from. But they will go in there and have the experience and feel it and connect to the authenticity, and then will probably buy it online. So that's an interesting thing in itself. And it's that idea of creating something meaningful out of a commercial experience, that you're actually feeling something almost spiritual, which sounds like a terrible thing to say, but shopping is a bit like that, isn't it? Like, if we're being really honest about that. It's quite significant. Okay, I'm coming. Emma's giving me the look. I could talk about this all night. I wanted to finish on this idea of art exhibitions because I think it's really relevant to this understanding of whether fashion needs art and vice versa. I think it's interesting that it's, in 2020, probably how many of you use Instagram in here? Oh, look at that, so many hands. I know some of you do, you just don't want to let on. Certainly in 2020, this idea of how we view the world is incredibly different. Like, I actually can't believe how much things have changed in 1 year. I can't actually fathom it. Things are moving so swiftly that it's almost impossible to keep up with. We can't keep up with those things. And again, to go back to when I was studying art history, and even when perhaps Fashion Icons was at the Art Gallery of South Australia, it was a different time. Even then it was different. Like, things have changed so much even since that time. So this is such an important exhibition because this was a game changer. This was Alexander McQueen at the Met in New York. And it did absolutely change the way that people thought about fashion. So people who'd never really heard of Alexander McQueen before went to look at that exhibition. And they were looking at it for a whole bunch of reasons, not because it was Alexander McQueen, but because they were just genuinely intrigued. And it's extraordinary, such an extraordinary amount of work. Again, that really haptic experience of the thing that is handmade. It had all of those qualities to it. But this show cracked, I think, 600,000 visitors. Like, that's just incredible. There isn't a gallery in the world that wouldn't give their right arm or their firstborn to have that many people come through. And so ever since that show, they have tried to recreate the magic of Alexander McQueen. Every fashion institution has tried to just crack it with that, to find that show that will do the same thing. But not everyone is Alexander McQueen, because he was that rare beast. He was that person who actually did traverse the arts and fashion. He just managed to bring the two together, and do these extraordinary things that no one else was really doing. So I think we're in this interesting dilemma right now, because I will be interested to see what shows. I think right now in the world there is a show about kimonos, which is, Rob, do you know about that show, Robert? I think it's a big show, and at the V&A. So that's worth having a look at. But I was thinking about that's a very interesting time to be doing that show, and they had the image that they'd used was of Madonna from her film clip, and I've just forgotten the name of the song, but you'll know it if you Google it. And I was thinking about how interesting that is, because again, we're living in a very different time of different sensitivities and ideas around cultural appropriation, how we can talk about things like that and whether we can or we can't. And of course, to go back to think about John Galliano at Dior and all the things that he did there, where he looked to Asian culture and he looked just like at every culture that he could kind of take inspiration from. Similarly, Yves Saint Laurent, who looked to every culture, and Russian culture, etc. I doubt that you could do that now. I think that would be one of those things where you'd just be cancelled almost immediately. So I think we're at this super interesting time, because if we think about what these two things, fashion and art, take from each other, what I hope they take from each other is a sense of experimentation. Because as someone who works in the arts, I worry a lot that that's the thing that's actually disappearing, because we're becoming really risk adverse. We're really worried that people are going to cancel us, or that you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to think about that. You're not allowed to, or even talk about it, or make an idea about it, or question it, or have a concept. And so many of these artists that I'm looking to, that I was showing about and thinking about, one of the most famous collections that Alexander McQueen did was a show called Highland Rape. And people got incredibly upset at the time, but he was actually making an analogy with what he deemed to be England's rape of Scotland, which was his culture. So he was very specifically talking about what had happened historically, but it was a very strong, violent, brutal fashion show. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, even today, 2020. No one's ever done anything like that. I'm not sure that that'll happen again, something quite that level. So to finish, so much more I could say, but those are the things that I hope we can cling to. I hope that out of that relationship with fashion and art, there will continue to be that sharing of ideas, because it can't always be about money, and yet we need to understand that those things can actually be mutually beneficial if we let them be mutually beneficial. So thank you all for listening to me. I hope we're going to have a few questions now as well. So. I need that.
Getting all my bits and bobs out the way. I didn't do the right thing by leaving my book on my chair. I did bring my copy of the book from 2013 that I had Mitchell and Alison sign at the book launch in Adelaide. Yes, of course. Thank you so much,
That'll
Alison.
be worth a fortune.
Of course. It's a shame that we can't do audience questions tonight, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking a few questions of Alison with a few minutes that we have left. We've got about 15 minutes or so. And I thought it would be really good to revisit sort of one of the points you sort of dangled a little bit, which was about what is it that makes an art and fashion collaboration intrinsically successful? Is, in your study and your reflection, there's some perfect ingredients, because you shared some wildly successful examples and also some that perhaps didn't hit the mark. And I'm just curious to unpack that a little bit more.
I think the most successful ones are the irreverent ones, the ones that dare to take a risk, because really those brands can afford to. They can afford to have a crack and it might not work. It's fine if it falls over. So one of the most successful I ever think was with Hermes, and they worked with Erwin Wurm, who's a famous Austrian artist who does these 1-minute sculptures, and they're very simple. He did a great project actually through COVID that's worth looking at with his daughter, and I saw he did this thing for British Vogue where they invited him to show what he was doing, and he had had his daughter and he was using her to make 1-minute sculptures, and they were fantastic. So a lot of his sculptures are about like, they're hilarious. Stick a pencil up his nose and different things, and it's like a 1-minute thing, and then you change the pose and you do something else. So he did things like that with Hermes. So he'd said to Hermes, I don't want you to do anything that you can sell. Like, I'm not interested in selling anything, but I will use your product and we will take photographs and then you can show them at the Hermes Foundation. And they were fantastic, like just ridiculous things where he'd sat and put an Hermes vase on his head. So the whole thing is about, the precariousness of it. It might fall off and crack. And it was a kind of an irreverence for the objects. Like they're not precious. They're just items. They might break, but I'm going to do something different with them. So that was really good. I think the ones that are irreverent, and certainly Marc Jacobs just had the formula. He did a hilarious, weird collaboration with Jake and Dinos Chapman that I know you guys will be familiar with because you've got that incredible work at the Art Gallery of South Australia. And they used objects and it was like really wacky, that wacky clothing, like the wackiest thing I've ever seen. But again, they sold like hotcakes at Louis Vuitton. Everyone wanted them because they were so almost ugly. They were ugly. It was great.
And that's what I was sort of musing on. I was thinking about it, those projects where it wasn't about the marketability, but it was more about experimentation and risk and potentially taking a fashion brand outside of its comfort zone. I mean, the example about Hermes, they're renowned for their artisanal making, as you said, and that's been a performance aspect of their shop fronts or storefronts, but actually inviting an artist who isn't about making a product or a physical outcome, so to speak.
Exactly. And, there are lots of things too. I mean, I came across projects that I won't mention because I'm not allowed to, but there were artists who had terrible experiences dealing with fashion houses, like really bad. And they're like, it was terrible and I would never do that again. Because the fashion house had said to them, we want to collaborate with you. And then the artist comes up with something and the fashion brand goes, oh, it's not really what we wanted. And then the whole thing gets diluted and becomes a bit hideous and doesn't work. But then it's too late and you've gone down a path and it's actually being manufactured and made and it just does not work. And that is the tension, I think. But that's the same for, it's like anything. If a musician is going to work with an artist on a film clip, or a writer is going to work with someone to do their cover, or it's trust, isn't it? And you can't be risk averse. You've got to have a go. Or a curator commissioning someone to make something. You don't really know what they're going to make.
Trust is at the core of that. Yeah. And I was this is a question I'd already had thought on before tonight's talk, but you've just touched on it absolutely, which was, what is the responsibility of the fashion industry to uphold the values of the artists that they work with to that point? If they are seeking, even Marc Jacobs, who did it very well, a marketable, commercially successful outcome, what is their obligation?
Exactly, and I think, I also know artists who've have come to me and said, what should I ask for in my contract, and I think you have to be really clear and say, this is what I want out of it. And then someone like Cindy Sherman is super interesting too, because she was approached by Balenciaga, and Cindy Sherman is so famous for always shooting herself in work. So what Balenciaga knew in asking her, she is going to appear in it, right? And her whole gesture was about, again, they're very ugly images, but that was the power of them, because it was that shock element of opening your art forum and it's a Balenciaga ad, but instantly it's Cindy Sherman, you're not quite sure what's going on, it's a bit weird. And all the major institutions in the world have acquired those works. They are owned by all those institutions. It's a trust thing. Again, Chanel wanted to do something with Cindy Sherman, and I was really lucky I got to do an interview with her, and she talked about it. She talked about how they sent to her apartment in New York all these things from their archive from the 30s, like extraordinary items. So she said she'd agreed to it, and then she kind of forgotten about it. And she gets this knock on the door, and these things come in, and she said it was like these coffins. They were like these huge trunks. And she works by herself, so she doesn't even have an assistant in Sherman. She does her makeup, everything on her own with a clicker, so no one. And she said she's pulling out these things that are in these incredible, like coffin-like boxes. And she said they were just extraordinary. Like, she couldn't believe Karl Lagerfeld had them packed up and just sent to her in New York. And she said also they were very, very tiny. So she had to, with some of the shots, sort of hold them against her body and then shoot herself wearing them. And she'd done, her wacky wigs and funny makeup. So again, that was a trust thing, because obviously Chanel are not going to get some beautiful image. They're going to get Cindy Sherman doing a wacky thing, wearing something from the 1930s. But they are the best images. And they make you look at the clothes in a way that you would not normally look at those clothes, which is extraordinary.
Taking them out of the runway context
Exactly.
is really important,
Yeah,
as you said, for credibility. I'm thinking a little bit about photography, actually. That's an enormous part of the intersection of art and fashion, and the desire for fashion houses to work with interesting photographers that don't tackle things in the normal way. And many photographers have made their art careers actually by working in the fashion industry also. So there's a really interesting intersection there.
It is an interesting thing, because photography is always a poor cousin in the art world. It's not unless you're Jeff Wall, you're not really going to be, considered like that. And a little shout out here, the next issue of Vault, I did an interview with Collier Shaw. So Collier Shaw is one of the biggest photographers working in fashion right now, but also has a very interesting career as an artist. Was personal assistant for Richard Prince, which is really interesting. Started showing in New York same time as Cindy Sherman, same time as Richard Prince. Has now developed this incredible career as a fashion photographer. So she just shot Janelle Monáe for the Vanity Fair cover, but through the computer, which is quite fascinating. So she was talking to me about that because she had already started working a bit like that, had decided maybe I don't want to go to London, maybe I'll experiment and see if I can do it through the computer. So when COVID came, she was like, yeah, I know how to do this. I've actually done this before. This is like totally fine. So she talked about how, this I thought was really, really interesting. She talked about the liberation of fashion photography, like why it was so liberating for her. So she had had an art career, but she talked about how for her, she'd found it really almost depressing to take your artwork to a gallery and the gallery being like, I think we can sell it. Can we sell it? I don't know. Like maybe we can't really sell that. Always a pressure to sell, give us more of that, but maybe not so much of this. And she just said to me on the phone, I love fashion photography because I get to do whatever I want. And they love it and they want it. I thought, isn't that fascinating? So this is somebody who's actually been on that side. Like she's done it. She's done the big art photography. She's still respected as an art photographer, but she loves fashion photography. And she loves all the things where, she can say to Michelle Williams, how do you feel about me dressing you as a man? How would you feel about that? So she literally brought in all this male clothing from fashion designers, and then she shot Michelle Williams. And Michelle Williams is talking about how I sat differently, I walked differently because I was wearing men's clothing. It was like fascinating, so fascinating. I thought, that's really interesting. And she basically said to me, what I hate about the art world is that there's this kind of amorphous money attached to it where it's not very clear. She said, fashion is very like, this is how much we're paying you. So this much? And it's going to be great. And she loved it. I thought, isn't that interesting? Like, you're not allowed to talk about that. You are not allowed to talk about it.
You've touched on that a few times, and I think that's a really astute observation. And I also wonder if that's at the crux of some of those tricky relationships you mentioned earlier, people not being able to be clear about what it is that they want, what is appropriate, what is a fair and reasonable rate of pay, etc. Yes. Those terms of engagement. In the art world, that is often very unclear, and that's actually a continuing issue for artists, and one that we're very keen to change. Yes, I was curious, just changing subject altogether, you talked a little bit about the GFC and how that didn't really have an impact on the major fashion houses, or in some respects had a net benefit.
Yeah.
How are we seeing anything about, are we understanding what's happening with COVID yet, or is it too soon?
No, I think my understanding is they're doing quite well. They're doing quite well because, again, people, well, this is quite an interesting thing. I've heard this anecdotally, but I think it's very interesting. I've been interested to talk to some of the art people in this crowd. I know of a lot of people who would normally go to Europe over summer, right, and spend, honestly, I mean, it's disgusting, like hundreds of thousands of dollars on holidays in Europe, and it's discretionary spending, and they're not going anywhere. So they are buying art, and they are buying fashion, and they're buying real estate. Have you noticed real estate's doing really well? It's like massive, massive. So all these things that I think people thought would fall over, have not fallen over. Interestingly, though, coming back, mid-level brands have. So in Brisbane, Rana, you'll be shocked to know, Country Road gone, out of the city, gone. Like, it's an iconic store, in this beautiful old bank building. It's gone. It shut. Sports Girl, which had been there since the 1980s, gone. So all of those brands struggled massively and will struggle for many years to come back from COVID. Other brands have just triumphed, done really, really, really well. So that's kind of fascinating, isn't it?
It's incredibly fascinating.
I think there is a lot of writing around that, about people's willingness to, this is part of the thing behind the Burberry trench coat as well. That is the reason that sells so well. Their number one seller is because people will buy a Burberry trench coat and have it for 50 years and then give it to their granddaughter or so on and so on. And Burberry will repair it for you. Things like that. That's very astute. It's a very astute thing to do. Same with Hermes. All of those luxury brands, if your bag is damaged, you can take it to them and they will fix it for you because they understand that you understand that there is a luxury in the gesture, in the hand, and it has a value. It has a value. And so I didn't mention it, but Chanel, one of the best things that Karl Lagerfeld ever did before he died is that he bought, as Chanel, he bought all of these ateliers in France. So he bought the sequin maker, the feather maker, the lace maker, and these are tiny, tiny companies with maybe 10 people in them, and they're all families, and they've all been doing it for hundreds of years. He bought them so that they would never go out of business, so that he could always go back to those companies and keep having handmade lace made.
And that's a very interesting point, reflecting on it from the perspective of artists and thinking about retaining the integrity and the long-standing skills that sit within the arts, and not letting something like this pandemic or these sorts of huge disruptions, and not to downplay it, it is enormous, wipe out an entire generation of practicing artists and makers, because our community couldn't afford to lose that.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, I'm hearing from some gallerists that there's commercially they've been doing really well, and then others are starting to shutter their shops. So it's interesting reflection on whether that's a legacy of many, many years of difficulty, or whether it's specifically related to the pandemic. I guess we'll yet to see in the next few years to come.
I think we are, but I was really lucky you took me today to the jam factory, and just watching people there making glass, oh my God, it was so amazing. If you've never done that, go and do it, because it gives you goosebumps, and you just realise how extraordinary that process is, like the actual making of an object is remarkable, and most of us are quite removed from that process just in our day-to-day life because of the nature of contemporary life. But even walking through the store there, I was thinking about how beautiful all of those handmade objects were, and you made the observation that the store had done quite well through COVID. So that's a very interesting thing, isn't it? That desire to buy something that will endure and have longevity but has the touch of the hand too. I think that's really...
And I think the other layer to that in South Australia, like every other place, the local has a whole new value associated with it.
Yes.
And something like buying objects from the jam factory that are crafted by South Australian makers, largely South Australians. Absolutely. There's that sense of looking after your own community and looking after your own arts, the legacy of that arts practice within that community.
Absolutely.
For our final question, I will give you a quote and ask you your reflection on it. So the painter Francis Bacon said, "Fashion is only the attempt to realise art in living forms and social intercourse." Alison Kubler says...
Oh my God, that's a really hard one to finish on. Right, well, I think fashion is an art form. In the right context and in the right hands, in the same way that art is art in the right hands as well. I think fashion has so much to tell us about everything that is happening in the world at any given time, and especially when we look back historically. And I think we'll only be able to look at this time, to look back and reflect on what it was that we were interested in or what we wore. I think it is an incredible social document. It's always been seen as less than important. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if we had a major fashion museum instead of a war memorial? Although, not to disparage that, I think a war memorial is important, obviously, but I think a fashion institute would be incredible too, to be able to go and see those things. And, if you talk to someone like Pamela Golban, so Pamela Golban has only recently retired, but she was the head of the Musée Les Arts Décoratifs. She's one of the most famous fashion historians in the world. And she absolutely understands fashion as an art form. And they make no distinction, even in that museum, they will show objects that come from fast fashion as well as objects from haute couture. And she thinks it's all relevant. It's all relevant and interesting and historically significant. I think that's really kind of interesting. Like, it really changed my mind when I spoke to her about that, because it all matters.
And I was having a conversation with some curators a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking about even the National Museum of Australia collecting objects that relate to the pandemic.
Yes.
And they're everyday objects,
yes.
They're everyday responses, and perhaps we won't know their value or their lack of value until we have some distance and some time. And I think that your comments on fashion speak in the same way.
Yeah, I think so. I saw a great show at MoMA. I've just forgotten the name of it. I'll have to think about it, but it was basically a show that looked at the idea of clothing. It took an item like a white shirt and it broke it down, and it showed 4 versions of a white shirt, and then it had a Black Panther beret, it had a singlet, it had a trench coat, it had all these very specific items from the history of fashion. So not all of them by any means, but it had chosen very specific items from 20th century fashion. It was honestly one of the best things I've ever seen as an exhibition, because they had done this very clever thing where they talked about why a white shirt was significant, and it pertained to everything across the history of the world. It wasn't just about how you wear the white shirt, it was about everything. And then talking about the politics, the fact that a trench coat comes from the war, that's extraordinary, and an audience now, talking to a young person in 2020, they wouldn't understand that, So it was a very powerful exhibition, but it just made me think about how fashion can tell us so much about the world.
Well, Alison, thank you so much for being here tonight and for joining us for this talk. Would you join me in thanking Alison for the talk?
Thank you.
Just a couple of little reminders. Our next